In the beginning, it rarely feels dangerous. In fact, it feels like the exact opposite of danger. It feels like magic. You meet someone and almost immediately they seem fascinated by you. They text you constantly. They remember small details about your life. They compliment things that other people have never even noticed. They say things like, I've never met anyone like you, or I feel like I've known you forever. Within days or weeks, the connection feels intense, electric, almost unreal. And that's exactly the point, because what you're experiencing in that moment may not actually be love. It may be something far more calculated. In psychology, there is a manipulation tactic known as love bombing, and it begins with overwhelming affection delivered at a speed that feels intoxicating but unnatural. The person floods you with attention, admiration, affection, validation, and emotional intensity. It feels powerful because it activates something very deep in the human brain, the reward system. When someone suddenly showers you with affection, praise, and emotional connection, your brain releases dopamine. Dopamine is the chemical associated with reward, anticipation, and pleasure. It is the same system involved in addiction, gambling, and powerful habits. The more unpredictable and intense the reward is, the more dopamine your brain releases. That means when someone rapidly alternates between affection, excitement, emotional intimacy, and future promises, your brain starts building a bond at an accelerated speed. This is called dopamine bonding. And dopamine bonding can happen long before you truly understand who the other person is. That's why love bombing works so well. It bypasses rational evaluation and goes directly into emotional attachment. When people fall in love naturally, emotional closeness typically grows gradually. Trust develops through shared experiences, consistent behavior, and time. But love bombing compresses that process into a very short window. Instead of weeks or months of gradual discovery, everything happens almost instantly. Compliments are exaggerated. Emotional intimacy appears immediately. Future plans appear quickly. The person might say things like, I can already see us together long term, or I've never felt this way before, or even I think you're my soulmate. When you hear statements like that early on, your brain interprets them as signs of deep connection. But the manipulator is not actually building connection, they are building dependency. Because the faster you emotionally attach, the easier it becomes to control the dynamic later. At first, everything feels perfect. They text good morning and good night every day. They want to see you constantly. They respond quickly, enthusiastically, and with intense emotional energy. They may buy gifts, write long messages, or express admiration in a way that feels almost cinematic. It resembles the type of romance people see in movies or read in stories. And that illusion is exactly what keeps people hooked, because it creates the belief that you have found something rare and special, something that almost never happens. But in many cases, what feels like destiny is actually strategy. Love bombers often study what you respond to emotionally. If you value appreciation, they will compliment you endlessly. If you value loyalty, they will talk about commitment immediately. If you value being understood, they will mirror your thoughts, your opinions, even your personality. Mirroring is another subtle psychological tactic often used alongside love bombing. When someone mirrors your interests and values, it creates the illusion of deep compatibility. Suddenly, they love the same music, share the same worldview, understand your struggles, and validate your experiences in a way that feels incredibly personal. But this connection may not be authentic. It may simply be adaptive behavior designed to create attachment quickly. Because once the emotional bond forms, the power dynamic begins to shift. At this early stage, most people feel lucky rather than cautious. After all, society constantly promotes the idea that intense early romance is a sign of real love. Movies celebrate it, stories glorify it. People are taught that when you meet the right person, everything should feel overwhelming and immediate. So when someone experiences love bombing, they often interpret the intensity as proof of compatibility rather than a warning sign. But here's the critical psychological detail: intensity is not the same as intimacy. Intensity is fast. explosive, and emotional. Intimacy is slow, stable, and built over time. Love bombing replaces intimacy with intensity because intensity creates faster attachment. And the faster the attachment forms, the harder it becomes for the victim to detach later when the manipulation begins. Because eventually, the love bombing stage ends. It almost always does, but it does not end abruptly. Instead, the manipulator slowly shifts the emotional pattern. The constant affection begins to fluctuate. Messages that once arrived instantly become delayed. Compliments become less frequent. Emotional warmth becomes unpredictable. This shift is extremely important from a psychological perspective because it introduces something called intermittent reinforcement. Intermittent reinforcement is one of the most powerful behavioral conditioning mechanisms known in psychology. It means that rewards appear unpredictably rather than consistently. When affection becomes unpredictable, the brain releases even more dopamine in anticipation of the next reward. This is the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. Slot machines do not reward players every time. They reward them occasionally and unpredictably. That uncertainty creates stronger engagement than consistent rewards ever could. Love bombing followed by emotional withdrawal creates the same cycle. At first, you experience intense affection. Then it becomes inconsistent. Now your brain begins chasing the return of the original feeling. You start wondering what changed. You replay conversations in your mind. You question whether you did something wrong. You try harder to regain the affection that once felt effortless. This is the moment where emotional control begins forming. Because once someone begins chasing approval, the dynamic has already shifted. In the beginning, the love bomber was the one giving. Now you become the one seeking. And this transition often happens so gradually that the victim barely notices it. What they notice instead is confusion. They remember how amazing the connection felt in the beginning, so they assume the current distance must be temporary. They believe the original affection was real and something simply disrupted it, so they try to restore it. They become more attentive, more accommodating, more forgiving. And ironically, those reactions increase the manipulator's power. Because love bombing is rarely about love, it is about leverage. The initial affection builds emotional investment. Once that investment exists, the manipulator can begin shaping the relationship in ways that benefit them. That shaping process may involve subtle criticism, guilt manipulation, emotional withdrawal, or creating dependency. But none of those tactics would work without the initial phase of idealization. Idealization is the first stage in many manipulative relationships. During idealization, the manipulator places you on a pedestal. They describe you as extraordinary, perfect, or uniquely special. Being idealized feels amazing because it feeds the human desire for recognition and belonging. But idealization has a hidden function. It sets an unrealistic emotional standard that can never be maintained permanently. And when that standard eventually collapses, the victim often blames themselves rather than the manipulator. They think something they did caused the shift. They try to return to the version of themselves that originally received the affection. And this is where psychological dependency deepens. Because now the relationship is no longer about mutual connection. It becomes about regaining approval. But to fully understand why love bombing works so effectively, we have to examine the deeper psychological vulnerabilities it targets. Human beings are wired for attachment. From early childhood, emotional survival depends on forming bonds with caregivers. That means the brain naturally responds very strongly to signals of affection, validation, and belonging. When someone suddenly provides all of those signals at once, the brain interprets it as safety and connection. It does not immediately question the authenticity of the signal. It simply responds to the emotional input. This is especially true for people who have experienced loneliness, rejection, or emotional neglect in the past. When someone who has felt unseen for a long time suddenly receives overwhelming attention and admiration, the experience can feel almost healing. It feels like someone finally understands them, finally appreciates them, finally sees them, and that emotional relief creates a powerful bond very quickly. Manipulators often sense these vulnerabilities intuitively. They identify people who are empathetic, caring, and eager to connect. Those qualities are not weaknesses in themselves. In fact, they are signs of emotional intelligence. But in the hands of the manipulator, empathy becomes a tool that can be exploited. Because empathetic people tend to give others the benefit of the doubt, they try to understand behavior rather than immediately judging it. That means when the manipulator's behavior eventually changes, the empathetic partner often rationalizes it instead of recognizing it as manipulation. They think the other person must be stressed, hurt, or misunderstood, and that compassion delays the moment when they recognize the pattern. Meanwhile, the manipulator continues shaping the emotional dynamic behind the scenes. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of love bombing is the memory it creates. The early phase of intense affection becomes a psychological anchor. Even months later, the victim may still remember those first weeks or months as proof that the relationship was once perfect. They may believe that the loving version of their partner is the real person, and that the current coldness or manipulation is just a temporary phase. That belief keeps them invested far longer than they otherwise would be, because they are not just attached to the person. They are attached to the memory of how the person made them feel in the beginning. And memories linked with dopamine are extremely powerful. The brain tends to romanticize them, replay them, and use them as motivation to continue pursuing the same emotional reward. In other words, love bombing does not just create attraction, it creates psychological momentum. By the time the manipulation becomes visible, the emotional investment is already deep. And that is why so many people fail to recognize love bombing while it is happening. The early phase feels too good to question. The affection feels too genuine to doubt. And the idea that someone might deliberately manufacture such intense emotional connection feels almost unbelievable. But the truth is that love bombing is rarely accidental. It is a pattern. And like most patterns in manipulation, it follows a predictable psychological structure. First comes idealization, then comes subtle withdrawal, and eventually, control begins to appear. But before the control stage fully emerges, the victim is already emotionally attached. And that attachment makes the next phase far more powerful than it would be otherwise, because the person is no longer evaluating the relationship objectively. They are trying to preserve the emotional high they experienced at the beginning, and the manipulator knows exactly how to use that. Once the initial stage of overwhelming affection begins to fade, something subtle but psychologically powerful starts to replace it. The relationship no longer feels like a constant stream of warmth and validation. Instead, it becomes unpredictable. One day, the manipulator may appear deeply affectionate again, almost like the early days of the relationship, sending long messages, expressing admiration, or acting intensely loving. But the next day, that warmth disappears. Replies become short. Attention fades. The emotional energy drops without explanation. This sudden shift creates confusion, and confusion is one of the most effective tools a manipulator can use. Because when people feel confused in a relationship, their first instinct is usually not to leave. Their first instinct is to figure out what went wrong. They search for explanations. They replay conversations in their mind. They analyze small details that previously felt insignificant. This is where the psychological trap begins tightening. In the early stage, the manipulator builds an emotional high through intense validation and affection. Now that high becomes inconsistent. But instead of breaking the attachment, inconsistency often strengthens it. This happens because of the way the human brain processes rewards. When rewards appear randomly rather than consistently, they create stronger behavioral conditioning. Psychologists call this intermittent reinforcement. It is the same principle used in casinos, gambling systems, and addictive games. If a slot machine paid out every time someone played, the excitement would fade quickly. But when the reward appears unpredictably, the brain becomes obsessed with the possibility of the next win. Love bombing followed by emotional withdrawal creates the same pattern. In the beginning, affection felt effortless. Now affection feels like something you must earn again. The manipulator may not say this directly, but their behavior begins to imply it. They may start introducing small criticisms disguised as concern. They might say things like, "You've been acting a little distant lately," or "I just wish you understood me better." These statements seem harmless on the surface, but they quietly shift responsibility for the emotional distance onto you. Instead of questioning why their behavior changed, you start questioning your own behavior. You begin adjusting yourself to restore the harmony that existed in the beginning. This is where the transformation from idealization to control slowly unfolds. During the love bombing phase, the manipulator elevated you. They made you feel extraordinary. But that elevation was never meant to last forever. It was meant to create contrast. Because once you have experienced being treated like someone special, losing that treatment feels painful. The brain begins chasing the restoration of that original emotional state. And the manipulator understands this dynamic, even if they never consciously study psychology. Some people develop these patterns instinctively through past experiences and personality traits associated with manipulation. They learn that affection can function as leverage. When affection is given freely, people feel secure. But when affection becomes conditional, people become anxious. And anxious people are easier to influence. Anxiety increases emotional sensitivity. It makes people more likely to comply, apologize, or overextend themselves in order to regain approval. Over time, the manipulator may begin setting subtle expectations. They might express disappointment if you spend time with friends instead of them. They might become distant when you disagree with them. They might withdraw emotionally after small conflicts rather than resolving them directly. These behaviors introduce a quiet form of conditioning. Your brain begins linking their affection with your compliance. When you behave in ways they like, warmth returns. When you assert independence, emotional distance appears. This creates a powerful psychological loop where you unconsciously adjust your behavior to maintain harmony. And this loop often develops without the victim realizing it. From the outside, someone observing the relationship might notice warning signs. They might see the imbalance of emotional power or the sudden shifts in affection. But from inside the relationship, those patterns feel harder to identify because the victim is still emotionally anchored to the early stage of idealization. They remember how amazing the connection once felt. That memory becomes a reference point for hope. They believe that if they can just restore whatever existed in the beginning, the relationship will return to that state permanently. But here is the difficult truth about love bombing. The early stage was never the stable version of the relationship. It was the performance. It was the most exaggerated, intensified version of affection designed to create attachment quickly. Once attachment exists, the manipulator no longer needs to maintain that level of effort. In fact, maintaining it would defeat the purpose. Because the real goal of love bombing is not endless romance. The real goal is emotional leverage. Once that leverage exists, the manipulator can begin shaping the dynamic around their own needs and preferences. This is also the stage where something called cognitive dissonance begins appearing in the victim's mind. Cognitive dissonance occurs when two conflicting beliefs exist at the same time. On one hand, the victim remembers the partner who once seemed deeply loving, attentive, and emotionally invested. On the other hand, they are now experiencing inconsistency, distance, or subtle manipulation. These two realities do not match, and the brain struggles to reconcile them. When cognitive dissonance appears, people often resolve it by protecting the version of reality that feels emotionally safer. In this case, that means preserving the belief that the partner is still fundamentally loving. Instead of seeing manipulation clearly, the victim searches for explanations that maintain the positive image of the relationship. They may believe their partner is going through stress, personal struggles, or emotional confusion. They might think the relationship simply entered a difficult phase that can be fixed with more patience and understanding. And that belief keeps them engaged in the dynamic much longer than they otherwise would be. Meanwhile, the manipulator continues subtly shifting the balance of power. They may begin introducing small forms of criticism that slowly chip away at the confidence they once built during the love bombing stage. A comment about how you react emotionally, a remark about how you misunderstand them, a suggestion that you are too sensitive or too demanding. Each of these statements may seem minor in isolation, but over time they begin influencing how you see yourself within the relationship. The person who once made you feel extraordinary now becomes the person whose approval you are trying to regain. This transition is not accidental. It is a classic psychological pattern often seen in manipulative dynamics known as the idealization and devaluation cycle. During idealization, the manipulator elevates the partner and creates emotional dependency. During devaluation, they slowly reduce that admiration and replace it with criticism, withdrawal, or emotional unpredictability. The purpose of the cycle is to destabilize the victim's emotional footing. When someone feels stable and confident, they maintain boundaries more easily. But when someone feels uncertain about their standing in a relationship, they often become more accommodating and self-sacrificing. That uncertainty creates a psychological environment where control becomes easier to maintain. Another important factor in this stage is the manipulator's ability to create selective moments of affection that revive hope. Even after periods of coldness or criticism, they may suddenly return to the loving behavior seen at the beginning. They might plan a romantic gesture, send a heartfelt message, or express intense appreciation again. These moments feel incredibly powerful because they reactivate the emotional memory of the early love bombing stage. The victim interprets this as proof that the relationship is still capable of returning to its original state. But in reality, these brief returns of affection often serve a strategic function. They reset the emotional hook. They remind the victim why they became attached in the first place. And they keep the psychological cycle alive. Because if the relationship were consistently cold or manipulative, the victim might recognize the pattern more quickly and leave. But the occasional return of warmth makes the situation ambiguous. It creates just enough hope to keep someone invested. Over time, this dynamic can evolve into a form of emotional dependency. The victim may begin prioritizing the relationship above other aspects of their life. They may withdraw from friends or hobbies that previously provided emotional stability. Their attention becomes focused on maintaining harmony with the manipulator, and the manipulator may subtly encourage this isolation by framing themselves as the only person who truly understands the victim. They might say things like, "No one else gets you the way I do," or "People don't understand our connection." These statements reinforce the emotional bond while simultaneously distancing the victim from outside perspectives that might challenge the relationship. And this isolation increases the manipulator's influence even further, because when someone's emotional world becomes centered around a single person, that person gains enormous psychological power. At this stage, the victim may feel both deeply attached and quietly uneasy. Something about the relationship feels different from the beginning, but they cannot easily explain why. They may sense that the emotional balance has shifted, but they still remember how intensely loved they once felt, and that memory continues to shape their decisions. Because the brain tends to prioritize emotionally powerful experiences, especially those linked with dopamine and attachment, the love bombing phase created one of those experiences. It created a moment that felt extraordinary. And once someone experiences that kind of emotional high, the desire to return to it can become incredibly strong. But this is exactly what makes love bombing such an effective manipulation strategy. It turns affection into a psychological anchor. The victim is not just responding to the present moment of the relationship. They are responding to the memory of what the relationship once felt like. And that memory keeps pulling them back into the cycle again and again, even as the dynamic becomes increasingly imbalanced. By the time the relationship fully transitions from idealization to control, the emotional bond has already been established. The manipulator no longer needs to create constant excitement or overwhelming affection. The attachment already exists. And once attachment exists, influence becomes much easier to maintain. The person who once felt like a source of pure emotional warmth gradually becomes the person whose approval determines the emotional climate of the relationship. And by the time many people begin recognizing the shift, they are already deeply invested, emotionally connected, and psychologically entangled in the pattern that began with something that looked like love. By the time the relationship reaches its later stages, the psychological structure created by love bombing is already firmly in place. What once felt like an extraordinary emotional connection has slowly transformed into something far more complicated. The affection that initially felt effortless now feels conditional. The warmth that once appeared constant now appears selectively. And the person who once made you feel deeply valued now seems to control the emotional climate of the entire relationship. This is the stage where control becomes more visible, but paradoxically, it is also the stage where leaving becomes the most difficult, because the bond created through love bombing is not a normal emotional bond. It is something closer to what psychologists often describe as a trauma bond. A trauma bond forms when cycles of intense affection and emotional distress occur repeatedly between two people. Instead of creating stability, the relationship alternates between emotional highs and emotional lows. These fluctuations generate a powerful attachment because the brain becomes conditioned to seek relief from the same person who is also causing the distress. In other words, the manipulator becomes both the source of emotional pain and the source of emotional comfort. And that paradox creates a deep psychological loop that can be extremely difficult to break. At this stage, many victims begin noticing patterns that once seemed invisible. They may realize that the affection always returns after moments of tension or conflict. They may start recognizing that disagreements often end with them apologizing even when the original issue was not their fault. They might also notice that expressing personal needs or boundaries triggers emotional withdrawal, guilt, or criticism from the manipulator. These patterns slowly reveal the underlying structure of control. But recognizing a pattern intellectually is not the same as breaking free from it emotionally. Because the emotional investment formed during the early love bombing stage still exists. The memory of how deeply loved you once felt continues to influence how you interpret the present. This is one of the most powerful psychological tricks embedded in love bombing. The manipulator creates a golden memory at the beginning of the relationship, a moment that feels almost perfect. That moment becomes a reference point for hope. Every time the relationship becomes difficult, the victim remembers that early stage and believes that version of the relationship can return if they just try harder or understand their partner better. But the early stage was never meant to be sustainable. It was designed to be overwhelming precisely because it would be temporary. The manipulator invests enormous emotional energy at the beginning not because that energy reflects their true relational style, but because it serves a strategic function. Once the emotional bond is formed, the dynamic can shift. And when the shift occurs, the victim often assumes something went wrong rather than recognizing that the initial intensity was never authentic in the first place. Another reason this pattern becomes so powerful is because it interacts with the brain's natural tendency to rationalize emotional investments. When people spend significant time, energy, and emotional vulnerability in a relationship, their mind instinctively tries to justify that investment. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as the sunk cost effect. The more someone has invested into something, the harder it becomes to walk away from it. Instead of abandoning the investment, the brain attempts to recover it. In relationships influenced by love bombing, this often means the victim continues trying to restore the early affection rather than questioning whether the relationship itself is healthy. They might believe that if they communicate more carefully, become more understanding, or avoid certain conflicts, the original connection will return permanently. But manipulation rarely disappears through effort alone. In fact, increased effort from the victim often strengthens the manipulator's position. Because effort signals emotional investment, and emotional investment increases leverage. At this stage, the manipulator may also begin introducing more overt forms of control. They might criticize the victim's friends or question their loyalty to others. They might frame independence as a threat to the relationship. They might say things like "you've changed" or "you're not the same person I fell in love with." These statements are particularly powerful because they reference the idealized version of the victim created during the love bombing stage. The implication is subtle but clear. The victim is responsible for restoring the harmony that once existed. This creates a form of psychological pressure where the victim feels obligated to prove their commitment by adjusting their behavior. And because the manipulator occasionally returns to moments of affection, the victim receives intermittent confirmation that their efforts might be working. This reinforces the cycle again. The brain interprets those brief returns of warmth as progress rather than recognizing them as part of the manipulation pattern. Over time, this cycle can significantly impact the victim's self-perception. The person who once felt admired and valued may begin doubting their own judgment, emotional reactions, or personal worth. This shift occurs gradually through repeated experiences of confusion and criticism. When someone constantly tries to understand why a relationship feels unstable, they often turn inward for answers. They begin wondering if they are too sensitive, too demanding, or too difficult to love. And that self-doubt makes the manipulator's influence even stronger. Because once someone begins questioning their own emotional interpretation of events, they become more dependent on the other person's version of reality. This dynamic can evolve into something resembling gaslighting, where the manipulator dismisses or reframes the victim's concerns in ways that make them doubt their perception. If the victim points out the inconsistency in affection, the manipulator may accuse them of being overly dramatic. If the victim expresses hurt, the manipulator may say they are imagining problems that do not exist. These responses shift the focus away from the manipulator's behavior and onto the victim's emotional reaction. And gradually, the victim begins second-guessing their instincts. But despite all of this psychological complexity, there is a moment that sometimes appears in these relationships where clarity begins to emerge. It may happen after a repeated pattern of emotional withdrawal. It may happen after a particularly painful argument, or it may happen slowly as the victim begins noticing that the relationship never truly returns to the stability they hoped for. Instead, the cycle continues repeating itself. Intense affection appears briefly, followed by distance, criticism, or emotional manipulation. Then the affection returns again just long enough to restore hope. Recognizing the cycle is often the first step toward breaking it. Because the moment someone understands that the early stage of overwhelming affection was not genuine intimacy, but rather a psychological hook, the entire structure of the relationship begins to look different. The intensity that once felt magical begins to appear strategic. The sudden emotional highs and lows begin to resemble conditioning rather than romance. And the memory that once kept the victim emotionally invested begins losing some of its power. Understanding love bombing is not about becoming cynical about affection or distrusting emotional connection. Genuine intimacy absolutely exists, and many healthy relationships begin with strong attraction and excitement. The difference lies in the pace and consistency of that connection. Healthy affection grows steadily. It respects boundaries. It allows both individuals to maintain independence while developing closeness over time. Love bombing, on the other hand, accelerates emotional intensity to an unnatural speed. It creates the illusion of deep connection before genuine trust has time to develop. And once that illusion creates attachment, the dynamic begins shifting toward control. The most important lesson in recognizing love bombing is understanding that real intimacy does not require overwhelming someone with affection in order to exist. It does not demand instant emotional fusion or dramatic declarations of destiny. Real connection builds gradually through consistency, honesty, and mutual respect. It leaves space for individuals to observe each other's behavior across time rather than forcing immediate emotional commitment. When someone truly values you, they do not need to flood your life with constant validation to secure your attachment. Their care appears through stable actions rather than dramatic intensity. And perhaps the most revealing difference is that healthy affection does not create confusion. It does not leave you wondering where you stand or why the emotional atmosphere keeps changing. Instead, it creates a sense of calm psychological safety. You feel valued without needing to constantly prove your worth. You feel connected without feeling trapped. Love bombing, in contrast, often feels exhilarating at first but eventually becomes emotionally exhausting. The same intensity that once felt like passion becomes the engine of instability. And by the time many people realize this, they are already entangled in a bond that began with something that looked exactly like love. But once you understand the psychology behind it, the pattern becomes easier to recognize. What once appeared like rare romantic intensity begins to reveal itself as a predictable cycle. And when that cycle becomes visible, it loses much of its power, because manipulation thrives in confusion and emotional overwhelm. Awareness interrupts both. The moment someone can step back and see the entire structure of love bombing from beginning to end, the illusion starts to fade. The overwhelming affection at the start is no longer proof of destiny. It becomes evidence of strategy. And recognizing that difference is often the first step toward reclaiming emotional clarity and rebuilding relationships that are based not on manipulation, but on genuine trust, balance, and psychological safety.